The forest floor didn't just tremble. It began to breathe. Cole pressed his palms against his ears as a low-frequency hum vibrated through his very marrow, turning his vision into a blurred smear of gray and green. In the center of the abandoned camp, the missing scientists' equipment hadn't been smashed. It had been rearranged into a perfect, terrifying spiral of boots, notebooks, and shattered glass, as if sorted by a mind that didn't understand human life. Every lens and screen had been pulverized into fine, crystalline sand from the inside out. Yet not a single leaf nearby was disturbed. A thick, metallic fog swallowed the trees, tasting of ozone and wet copper. Cole fumbled with a recovered digital recorder, his fingers slick with the blood leaking from his own nose. Amidst the shrieking static of the device, a sound emerged that froze the air in his lungs. The clear, melodic laughter of his sister, who had vanished 10 years ago. As the ultrasonic pulse struck again, threatening to liquefy his internal organs, a small figure in a red coat flickered between the ancient oaks. A ghost from a past that he thought he'd buried, beckoning him deeper into a silence that was starting to scream. Cole Eliot Darby killed the ignition of the battered Ford F-150, the engine's final shudder rattling the loose coins in the center console. Silence rushed into the cabin, heavy and expectant. Beyond the windshield, the Monongahela National Forest loomed like a wall of ancient, rusted iron. The truck's tires rested inches from a sagging, rusted gate, its chain-link flesh scarred by time and neglect. Nailed to the wood and wire were neon orange signs, their colors screaming against the muted greens of the West Virginia wilderness. Strictly prohibited. No trespassing. Danger. Cole stepped out of the cab, the soles of his boots hitting the gravel with a definitive crunch. The air tasted of wet pine needles and stagnant water, a thick, cloying cocktail that coated the back of his throat. He looked at the plastic park service shields nearby. They were warped, their edges melted into jagged, weeping shapes as if licked by an invisible flame. Biological hazard warnings flickered in the periphery of his vision, but he ignored them. He adjusted the nylon straps of his tactical pack, the weight a familiar burden against his lean, exhausted frame. With a single, heavy stride, he crossed the forbidden line. Dry twigs snapped beneath his feet, sounding like small-caliber gunshots in the stillness. He didn't look back at the asphalt road or the fading heat of the truck. He only saw the gray, interlocking trunks of the forest closing in behind him, swallowing the pale afternoon light until only the deep shadows remained. The deeper Cole pushed into the thickets, the more the world seemed to lose its breath. 3 miles in, the ferns grew waist-high, their fronds brushing against his trousers with a dry, papery hiss. He stopped, pressing a scarred palm against the rough, scaly bark of a towering white pine. A realization colder than the mountain air seeped into his marrow. The forest had gone mute. There were no trilling chickadees, no rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker, not even the distant, frantic chatter of a squirrel. Above him, he spotted a cluster of nests nestled in the crooks of the branches. But they were skeletal and hollow, abandoned husks of a former life. The silence wasn't a lack of noise. It was a physical weight, a pressure that pushed against his eardrums until he could hear the frantic, rhythmic thud of his own pulse hammering in his neck. He tilted his head back, scanning the dense canopy for the blur of a moth or the hum of a fly. But the air remained sterile. The Monongahela had transformed into a pressurized chamber, a vacuum where every scrape of his boot against a stone echoed like a cannon blast, reverberating through the unnatural stillness of the timber. A flash of synthetic color broke the monotonous gray and green ahead. Cole approached a bright yellow plastic marker driven deep into the stony Appalachian soil. It was the first breadcrumb, a navigational post left by the missing bioacoustics team. As he reached out, his fingers hovered for a second before making contact with the plastic. The surface wasn't smooth. It was coated in a translucent, viscous film that shimmered like spilled oil. When he pulled his hand away, the substance clung to his glove in thin, shimmering threads, stretching like melted wax or thick saliva. He brought his hand to his face, his nose wrinkling at a sharp, metallic stench. The pungent bite of ozone mixed with the cloying, sweet rot of decaying meat. Beneath the slime, the yellow plastic appeared pitted and scarred, the edges rounded off as if an industrial acid had been poured over it. Cole wiped his palm against a patch of damp moss, a shudder rippling down his spine. The coldness in his gut wasn't from the wind. It was the realization that whatever had touched this marker wasn't part of any biological catalog he knew. The ground didn't just move, it shivered. Cole lunged for a nearby oak, his fingers digging into the bark as the earth beneath his boots began a subtle, rhythmic vibration. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit him, a physical blow that sent his stomach into a knot and forced him to double over. Deep within the architecture of his skull, a heavy, low-frequency hum began to bloom. It wasn't a sound for the ears. It was a resonance that bypasses the senses to vibrate directly against the bone. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to vomit as his internal organs seemed to dance to a subterranean drumbeat. Dark spots danced across his vision, blurring the edges of the trees. He stared down at the forest floor, watching in a daze as pebbles and dry needles began to hop and jitter in the dirt, dancing in perfect, terrifying synchronization with the infrasonic rhythm rising from the bedrock of the Monongahela. He broke into a small clearing moments later and froze. The camp of the missing scientists sat before him, looking remarkably undisturbed, yet fundamentally wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, no shredded fabric or overturned tables. Instead, Cole saw sleeping bags, leather boots, tin cans, and waterproof notebooks laid out on the grass in a terrifyingly precise geometric arrangement. Everything radiated outward from the cold ashes of the central fire pit in a perfect, expanding spiral. Each fork lay exactly parallel to the next. Every hiking boot was turned at a specific, calculated angle. Cole moved around the perimeter of this strange mosaic, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was afraid to even breathe too hard, fearing he might disrupt the flawless symmetry of this madness. This wasn't the work of a panicked human or a scavenging animal. It looked like the cold, clinical sorting of an entomologist pinning beetles to a board, a display of human property rearranged by a mind that viewed them as nothing more than curiosities. Cole knelt before a heavy-duty tripod near the edge of the spiral. Mounted on top was a high-end acoustic recorder, a piece of equipment worth more than his truck. He reached for the casing but stopped when he saw the lens. The glass of the high-sensitivity microphone was a spiderweb of fine fractures, all radiating from a single point in the center like a frozen explosion. He shifted his gaze to the nearby laptop. The liquid crystal display had ruptured from the inside out, the black ink of the pixels bleeding into a grotesque, nihilistic smear across the screen. He moved from sensor to sensor, finding the same wreckage everywhere. The glass surfaces of every instrument had been reduced to fine crystalline sand. There were no dents, no scratches on the metal housings, no signs of impact. Whatever had done this hadn't hit the equipment. It had simply vibrated the molecular structure of the glass until it could no longer hold itself together. Searching through the flattened grass near the roots of a gnarled beech tree, Cole's hand closed around a small, handheld digital voice recorder. He pressed the play button, and the tiny speaker spat out a jagged wall of static. He adjusted the volume, his breath hitching as muffled voices began to emerge from the white noise. The scientists weren't talking. They were whispering in frantic, breathless bursts. They spoke of voices in the dirt, claiming the very soil beneath their tents had begun to sing. Cole heard the lead researcher's voice tremble, describing rhythmic vibrations that seemed to form words in a language that felt older than the mountains themselves. The hair on Cole's neck stood on end. The recording ended abruptly with a sharp, crystalline chime. A sound so pure and terrifying, it felt like a needle piercing his brain. He gripped the recorder tight, the silence of the actual forest now feeling even more predatory than the noise on the tape. The sun didn't set. It was extinguished. Cole looked up as the light vanished, replaced by a wall of fog that didn't drift so much as it crawled between the trees like a living thing. The white shroud was unnaturally dense, swallowing the trunks of the pines until the world was reduced to a milky, featureless void. Within seconds, his visibility dropped to arm's length. He held his hand out, watching his fingers disappear into the haze as if they were being erased. The fog felt heavy, a wet blanket that smelled of burnt rubber and copper. It forced its way into his lungs, leaving a metallic tang on his tongue. He turned in a slow circle, but the sky and earth had merged into a single, claustrophobic cocoon. The sound of his own breathing became muffled and dull, as if he were wrapped in layers of thick wool, and the familiar crunch of the forest floor beneath his boots turned into a silent, ghostly tread. The world exploded in a silent strike. Cole hit his knees, his hands flying to his head as a massive ultrasonic pulse slammed into his skull. It wasn't a sound he could hear, but a physical impact that sent a white-hot spike of agony through the back of his eyes. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the noise was internal, a screaming resonance generated within the bone itself. The clearing began to spin, the trees tilting at impossible angles as his equilibrium shattered. He felt a warmth tickle his upper lip and wiped it away with a trembling hand. His fingers came away stained with thick, bright crimson. He tried to stand, but his legs were lead, and the world tilted again, dumping him back onto the damp needles. He gasped for air, feeling an invisible pressure mounting in the atmosphere, a weight that felt as if it were trying to collapse his skull from the inside out. He fumbled for the voice recorder again, bringing it inches from his ear, desperate to hear anything over the ringing in his head. He rewound the last few seconds, ignoring the static that clawed at his senses. Amidst the chaotic roar of electromagnetic interference, a sliver of sound emerged, a melodic, haunting cadence. Cole stopped breathing. From the tiny speaker came the soft, lilting voice of Maya. It was a sound he had buried under years of guilt and whiskey, yet he recognized it instantly. Cole, Cole, the voice whispered, using the pet name she had only used when they were children, huddled together against the dark. His heart skipped a beat, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Maya had been gone for 10 years, lost in a different woods. But the inflection, the slight, playful lilt at the end, it was her. He frantically hit the rewind button, his thumbs shaking, terrified that his mind had finally snapped and started feeding him his own ghosts. Cole stared into the white wall of the fog, his eyes straining until they ached. 10 paces away, a movement flickered, a tall, spindly shadow that seemed to have no defined edges. He slowly raised his right hand to rub his eyes, and the shadow in the mist mirrored the gesture with impossible precision. He stepped to the left, and the silhouette drifted with him, maintaining the exact distance. He could see the long, unnaturally thin limbs of the entity bending, mimicking his tense posture. It had no face, just a dark, featureless void where a head should be. Yet Cole felt a gaze on him that was heavy and clinical. He froze, and the shadow froze. He tilted his head, and the shadow mimicked the angle, mocking his confusion with a silent, perfect symmetry that made his skin crawl. A scream tore through the fog, sharp and desperate. It was Maya's voice, echoing from the dense heart of the whiteout. It sounded so close, as if she were standing just behind the next tree, her voice cracking with a terror he remembered from their childhood. Cole didn't think. He didn't check his compass or look for the trail. He bolted. He tore through the mist, his lungs burning as he shoved aside the grasping branches of the hemlocks. Cole burst through a wall of thorny briars, the sharp needles tearing at his jacket and skin, and stumbled onto a patch of scorched, barren earth. In the center of a ring of spent shell casings, a man crouched over a portable camping stove. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a high-end hiking jacket, but his face was a mask of soot and madness. Cole watched, paralyzed, as the man gripped a heavy hunting knife, its blade glowing a dull, angry cherry red in the blue flame of the burner. The air was thick with a foul, unmistakable scent of seared flesh and sulfur. Without a flinch, the man raised the glowing steel to his right eye. A sickening hiss filled the air, like water hitting a hot engine block. A plume of white, acrid smoke rose from the man's face, but he only gritted his teeth, pressing the metal deeper into the socket. Cole lunged forward, his boots skidding on the loose gravel as he reached for the man's wrist. But the old man, Elias Woods, Cole realized from the melted ID badge dangling by a thread, twisted away with a strength born of pure hysteria. Elias drove an elbow into Cole's jaw, the impact sending a spray of blood and spit into the dirt. "You're not real?" Elias shrieked, his voice a ragged tear in the silence. "Just a vibration, an acoustic trick of the plates." Cole dodged a wild, blind swing of the knife, seeing the dark, cauterized ruin of Elias's eyes weeping fluid down his cheeks. The scientist scrambled backward, wedging himself under a fallen log, his fingernails clawing at the bark until they bled. "Make it stop!" he wailed, flailing at the air as if trying to swat away a swarm of invisible bees. Cole threw himself onto the man, pinning him to the earth, feeling the frantic, irregular gallop of Elias's heart beneath his palms. He forced Elias's arms together, cinching them tight with a length of nylon cord from his pack. As the knot tightened, a sharp, biting electric jolt surged up through the soles of Cole's boots, arcing from the very stones of the clearing. The ground beneath them didn't just shake. It buckled in a violent, low-frequency spasm. Cole felt his diaphragm lock up, the air punched out of his chest by an invisible fist. His heart rhythm went wild, skipping beats, and then racing, a mechanical failure of the pulse. Elias arched his back, his sightless sockets turned toward the canopy, a wet, rhythmic rattle escaping his throat that matched the thrumming of the earth. Cole gripped the exposed roots of a pine, his knuckles white, fighting the insane urge to reach for his own knife and cut the sound out of his chest. Cole fumbled for his compass, his fingers clumsy and numb. Inside the brass housing, the steel needle was a blur. Spinning with such velocity, it looked like a gray disk. He shoved it away and thumbed the power on his GPS. The screen flickered to life, but instead of a map, it was a pulsing, neon green smear. The digital readout was a chaotic mess. The indicator showed him moving in a frantic, jagged zigzag, claiming he was miles from his actual location while he was standing perfectly still. The liquid crystals began to darken, swirling into concentric circles that looked like a staring eye. He shook the device, but the coordinates vanished, replaced by a string of nonsensical symbols, jagged, runic shapes that looked more like ancient carvings than computer code. He hoisted Elias's limp form over his shoulder, the scientist's weight a dead, shifting mass. As he began to navigate through a graveyard of rotting timber, Elias's head lolled against Cole's neck. The man began to speak, a hot, feverish stream of words hissed directly into Cole's ear. "This place, it's a resonator," Elias whispered, his breath smelling of copper and bile. It doesn't just bounce sound, it bounces the soul. It finds the rot you buried and gives it a frequency. Cole felt a cold sweat break out along his spine. Elias claimed the forest was feeding on the lies Cole had told himself for a decade. Cole stumbled over a hidden root as Elias's voice rose, talking about the unspoken truth that lived in the bedrock of the Monongahela, a truth that was starting to hum in harmony with Cole's own guilt. The trail didn't end. It simply ceased to be, blocked by a massive, blackened oak that looked as if it had been struck by lightning 1,000 times. Hanging from a low, twisted limb was a small, bright red wool coat, its brass buttons gleaming with a dull, sickly light. Cole stopped, his breath catching in a dry throat. He knew every stitch of that fabric. He remembered the ink stain on the left cuff from when Maya had been playing with their father's pens. It was the coat she had been wearing the night she vanished. The garment swayed gently, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion, even though the air in the woods remained as stagnant as a tomb. Cole took a tentative step forward, the blood in his temples thumping with a heavy, heated pressure that made his vision blur. The red was too bright, a wound against the gray bark of the dead tree. He reached out, his trembling fingers inches from the soft wool collar. The moment his skin brushed the fabric, the red vanished. The coat didn't fall. It disintegrated, the wool turning into gray, weightless ash that drifted to the moss like soot. Cole jerked his hand back, the smell of ancient smoke filling his lungs. From behind the massive trunk of the oak, Maya's voice drifted out, not the playful whisper from the recorder, but a sharp, vibrating hiss. "Coward," she spat. The word hit him like a physical blow. He spun around, but the shadows were empty, just the jagged silhouettes of the hemlocks. The voice grew louder, a multi-tonal chorus of accusations, screaming that he had stayed in the warmth of the house while she had frozen in the dark, her fingers turning blue in the rain. Cole pressed his palms over his ears, but the world began to warp anyway. The straight, vertical trunks of the pines around him seemed to soften, bending at acute, impossible angles. The wood rippled like liquid, the bark folding into creases that looked like pale, diseased skin. The forest was no longer a place of trees. It was becoming a pulsing, organic corridor, the walls shimmering with a wet, mucus-like sheen. He tried to run, but the ground had turned to the consistency of thick tar, dragging at his boots. Above him, the branches wove themselves into a tight, suffocating canopy, blocking out the last of the gray light and creating a tunnel that seemed to contract with every frantic breath he took. The air grew thick with the smell of old copper and wet earth. A flash of movement caught his eye. A small, slight figure in a short dress standing in a gap in the fog. "Maya!" he roared, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, ignoring the branches that whipped across his face. The girl darted between the trees, a flickering ghost that stayed exactly 10 yards ahead, no matter how fast he ran. He made one final, desperate leap through a screen of mountain laurel and slammed his heels into the ground. He skidded on a ledge of crumbling slate, his toes hanging over the edge of a vertical drop. A massive, rocky abyss yawned before him, the bottom lost in a sea of churning white mist. He teetered on the brink, watching as a few loose stones tumbled into the void, vanishing without a sound. The figure of the girl stood for a second in the air above the pit before dissolving into a cloud of pale vapor. He collapsed onto the dirt, his lungs heaving, and felt something hard press against his hip. He reached into Elias's jacket pocket and pulled out a leather-bound field journal. He flipped the pages, finding them covered in a frantic, jagged script that looked like the scratching of a bird. The final entries were a descent into hell. Elias didn't write about monsters. He wrote about the team. He described how they had stopped seeing each other and started seeing their own worst enemies. Cole read the account of a bloody struggle by the fire, where men who had been friends for years beat each other to death with stones, screaming names that didn't belong to anyone in the camp. The forest, Elias claimed, had replaced their reality with their most shameful memories, turning their colleagues into living avatars of their own sins. He leaned his back against a cold slab of stone, his eyes heavy with a fatigue that felt like lead in his veins. But as soon as his eyelids drifted shut, the vibration in the ground intensified, surging through his spine and into the base of his brain. A memory from 10 years ago exploded behind his eyes. The blue flash of lightning through a bedroom window and Maya's small, frantic hand rattling the door handle. He saw himself, huddled under the blankets, eyes squeezed shut, pretending to be asleep because the thunder made him feel small and helpless. The vibration of the Monongahela carried the chill of that long-ago storm, the damp smell of the hallway, and the sticky, cloying shame of listening to his sister's footsteps fade away into the woods. He groaned in his sleep, the earth beneath him seemingly drinking in the old terror. A sharp, grating sound, stone on stone, snapped him awake. He looked up to find Elias standing over him, the nylon cords frayed and snapped against a sharp edge of slate. The blind scientist held a jagged, heavy piece of granite above his head with both hands, his face twisted into a mask of ecstatic, terrifying peace. Elias let out a wet, guttural hiss. Cole threw himself to the side, his shoulder hitting the sharp gravel as he rolled. The granite slab hit the earth with a sickening, heavy thud, burying itself in the soft loam exactly where his head had been resting. A plume of dust and decayed pine needles erupted into the air, the smell of a disturbed grave filling Cole's nose. He scrambled back, his fingers raw and bleeding from the slate, as Elias stood over the impact site, his chest heaving. The ground seemed to groan under the force of the blow, a shallow crater marking the spot where Cole's life had almost ended. He could feel the cold, electric tingle of adrenaline racing down his spine, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Cole surged to his feet, his hands coming up in a defensive crouch. But Elias didn't strike again. Instead, the scientist let out a high, melodic wail that vibrated in Cole's very teeth. The man turned with a frantic, jerky motion and vanished into the thick, white wall of the fog. Cole saw the flash of a dirty sleeve before the mist swallowed the man whole. He didn't hesitate. He went after him, guided by the sound of snapping branches and the heavy, rhythmic thud of feet hitting the earth toward the massive rock face in the distance. As he approached the base of the cliff, the air began to shimmer and dance, the heat haze distorting the trees until they looked like melting wax. He pressed his shoulder against the cold, vertical face of the monolith, and a jolt went through him. The stone was humming. The resonance near the cliff was so intense it began to bend the light itself. Cole watched as the green of the ferns and the gray of the boulders bled away, replaced by shifting, oily smears of heat, angry reds, bruised purples, and a sickly, jaundiced yellow. A greasy film seemed to coat his vision, turning the forest into a nightmare seen through a cracked lens. Every breath he took felt like a physical weight against his chest, and the cliff roared at a frequency that made his eyes vibrate in their sockets, blurring the world until it was nothing but a landscape of pulsing, rhythmic pain. He shielded his eyes and looked up. On a flat ledge 50 feet above, the silhouette of James Hansen stood outlined against the fog. The last scientist was a frantic, twitching shape, moving in time with the invisible waves. Cole watched as Hansen pulled a handgun from his belt and leveled it at the empty air. The sharp crack of gunfire tore through the heavy atmosphere, the muzzle flashes looking like long, orange streaks in the distorted light. Hansen was screaming, but the words were eaten by the low-frequency roar of the mountain, leaving only the sight of his working jaw and the wild, rolling whites of his eyes as he hunted shadows that only he could see. Cole dove behind a jagged spur of rock, the surface slick with a black, oily lichen. A split second later, a bullet from Hansen's gun shrieked off the stone inches above his head, spraying him with a shower of white sparks and hot grit. The smell of cordite bit into his nose, instantly followed by a high-pitched, drilling whistle that made his molars ache. Every shot Hansen fired echoed through the canyon, the forest floor amplifying the sound until it felt like a series of physical blows against Cole's eardrums. He curled into a ball, pressing himself into the freezing stone as the lead chewed through the limestone, the anomaly catching the noise and throwing it back in 1,000 shattered pieces. He tried to push off the ground to find better cover, but his legs failed him. The resonance had reached a fever pitch, and his bones began to thrum with a deep, sickening heat, as if his marrow were being brought to a boil. His knees buckled, the strength draining out of his muscles like water from a punctured bucket. A fine, uncontrollable tremor took hold of his hands, a vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. He stared at his fingers, watching them jitter and twitch, unable to even grip the straps of his pack. He tried to crawl, but the world tilted, the horizontal plane of the earth turning into a shifting, vibrating sea that made his stomach heave. He looked up through the haze and felt his heart stop. Standing 3 paces away, emerging from the gray curtain of the fog, was Maya. She wore the red coat, but the fabric was gray with rot, the hem tattered and trailing in the dirt like old cobwebs. Cole looked into his sister's face and saw a stranger. Her features were pulled into a tight, asymmetrical mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. The skin across her forehead was translucent, showing the white ridges of bone beneath, and her mouth was locked in a silent, jagged snarl. Her eyes were dark pits, reflecting nothing but the murky, stagnant light of the forest. He watched her small hands curl into fists, the brass buttons on her coat straining until they began to pop and fly into the leaves. The ghost raised a pale, thin hand, pointing a finger directly at the old scar on Cole's side. In that instant, a spike of agony shot through him, so sharp it felt as if a red-hot iron had been driven into his gut. A low-frequency pulse, perfectly timed with her gesture, slammed into his torso, making his internal organs lurch with a sickening, liquid thud. He doubled over, gasping for air that felt as thick and acidic as smoke. Something seemed to rupture in the back of his head, and his vision was flooded with a dark, bruised red as the invisible force continued to twist and grind deep within his abdomen, tearing at his very center. He tried to scream her name, to beg for a stop, but his throat was a dry, constricted desert. He fell into a fit of violent, wet coughing, the taste of copper filling his mouth. With every spasm, a fine spray of crimson hit the gray slate at his feet. The pressure of the sound had finally pushed his lungs to the breaking point. He clutched his chest, feeling the frantic, bubbling rattle in his breath. Maya remained motionless, a silent judge, as he retched up dark, thick blood that looked like ink against the stone. His vocal cords were paralyzed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, wet wheezing in the hollow of the canyon. Hansen spun around, the sound of Cole's coughing cutting through his own madness. The scientist's eyes locked onto Cole, but the man didn't see a rescuer. In the grip of the forest's resonance, Cole had become a monster from Hansen's own dark history. Hansen leveled the pistol, the barrel steadying on Cole's chest. He screamed a name that meant nothing to Cole, a string of accusations about betrayal and old blood. Cole watched the man's finger tighten on the trigger, the knuckle turning white. He saw the hunter's focus, a lethal clarity born of total psychological collapse, as Hansen prepared to fire at the demon he thought he saw. Cole was pinned, his back against the humming wall of the cliff, the stone itself vibrating against his shoulder blades. To his left The black muzzle of Hansen's gun waited to spit lead. To his right, the silent, freezing shadow of Maya advanced, a wall of cold that seemed to suck the very heat from his blood. The space between the two threats was a narrow, suffocating vice. The air had become so dense with sound and hatred that it felt like a physical barrier, a wall of gelatinous pressure that kept him from even raising his hands to shield his face from the coming strike. He saw Maya's hand rise, her fingers hooked like talons, and at the same moment, he saw Hansen's finger reach the end of the trigger's travel. Cole didn't move to dodge. He didn't dive for the dirt or reach for the knife at his belt. Instead, he let his muscles go limp. The heavy Remington carbine slid from his shoulder, the wood stock hitting the granite with a dull, final thud. He unbuckled the chest strap of his pack and let the weight fall, the nylon bag spilling out his maps and gear onto the cold stones. He stood there, his chest open and defenseless before Hansen's sights, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The grit on his palms felt sharp, but he didn't clench them into fists. He was done carrying the weight, the gear, the weapons, the decade of armor he had built around his heart. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the ghost of his sister. Her feet didn't seem to touch the moss, but he moved until he could feel the unnatural chill radiating from the rotted red wool of her coat. He spread his arms wide, exposing the hollow of his throat and the space between his ribs. Maya's shadow loomed over him, the scent of stagnant rain and wet earth filling his head. But he didn't flinch. He didn't pull away when her pale, skeletal fingers reached for his neck. He took a deep, shaky breath, meeting the freezing mist of her presence with his eyes wide open, allowing the fog of her memory to wash over his skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, plunging the world into a different kind of darkness. His lips moved, the words dry and brittle as they left his mouth. "I left you," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the hum of the mountain. "I stayed under the covers because I was a coward. I heard you, and I stayed in the dark." The admission felt like pulling a rusted shard of glass from his throat. He confessed to the fear that had paralyzed him 10 years ago. The choice to stay warm while she vanished into the storm. Every syllable felt like a heavy stone dropping into a deep, silent pool. He felt the air leave his lungs in a long, shuddering exhale. And for the first time in a decade, the space in his chest didn't feel like it was filled with lead. The mountain went dead. The roar that had been chewing at his sanity for hours simply vanished, as if a giant hand had reached down and turned off a switch. The silence that followed was so absolute, it was violent. A vacuum that made his ears pop and his head swim. The only sound left was the ragged, terrified gasping of James Hansen. The pressure that had been crushing Cole's ribs evaporated. Hansen froze, his finger locked on the trigger, his pistol trembling so hard it clattered against his own knuckles. The forest around them became a still life. The trees no longer rippling, the shadows returning to their proper, inanimate shapes. Cole opened his eyes. The figure in the red coat was no longer a monster. The angry, glowing light had faded from her eyes, and the jagged snarl had softened into the face of the little girl he remembered. The rot seemed to fall away from the wool, leaving it looking like nothing more than an old, faded garment. Maya wasn't screaming or cursing. She looked at him with a quiet, hollow sadness that was harder to bear than any ghost. Her image began to fray at the edges, turning into a fine, silver mist. The red coat lost its color, becoming as pale as the fog. Cole watched as the manifestation of his guilt dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the cold mountain air. He turned toward Hansen, who had slumped against a boulder, the pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. Cole didn't say a word. He walked over, picked up the gun, and tucked it into his own belt. He reached down, grabbing the scientist by the collar of his jacket and hauling him to his feet. Hansen offered no resistance. He was a hollow shell, his mind vacated by the sudden absence of the noise. Cole looked at the man's vacant eyes and saw a reflection of the man he had almost become. He began the long trek back. He found Elias huddled near a grove of hemlocks, the blind man shivering and weeping in the newfound silence. Cole didn't offer comfort. He simply grabbed Elias's arm and forced him to move. He led the two broken men through the woods, his own body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. As they passed the massive, blackened oak where the coat had first appeared, something caught the light in the dirt. Cole knelt, his fingers brushing aside the damp needles. It was a small, silver hair clip, shaped like a pine branch. It was rusted, the metal pitted by years of exposure to the West Virginia rain. He picked it up, the cold metal biting into his palm. It wasn't a hallucination or an acoustic trick. It was a piece of reality, a final, undeniable proof of a life ended in the dark. He didn't cry. He simply closed his hand over it and kept walking. They reached the truck as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. Cole loaded the two scientists into the cab, their movements mechanical and slow. He climbed into the driver's seat and looked at the forest one last time. The Monongahela stood silent and indifferent, a vast sea of timber that kept its secrets well. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, a normal mechanical sound that felt like a blessing. As he pulled away from the rusted gate, Cole felt the weight of the hair clip in his pocket. The ghosts weren't gone, but the air in the cab was finally quiet. He drove toward the highway, leaving the echo of the forest behind, ready to face the silence of the world outside.